Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, I want to talk about the potential benefits of the administrative components of the mental health field. Now, this episode, pretty obviously, would be targeting mostly, fellow professionals, but I also understand lay people. It could be insightful to peer behind the curtain and see the stuff that we do. I hope it's interesting to anybody, but of course, of particular interest in use for my fellow providers out there. Now, before I get into that, I'm going to have two primary domains. One is like intake initial conceptualization, and number two is going to be like progress notes around therapeutic processes. I'm really narrowing focus on therapy rather than things like psych testing, etc. I think we could generalize pretty easily, but that's what I'm going to focus on. But before I get into that, I'm going to go into AI very briefly because it's on the scene. I could have shot this episode years ago. The content is really not changing, but the existence of AI begs of at least a small section that I will timestamp around talking about the pros and cons of AI. So jumping into that, the obvious pro is that offloading grunt work, offloading things that really don't have a lot of meaning or impact on people's care or on the experience of the service at hand, it's all the better. I mean, I think particularly around managed care, this is the use of insurance, they have documentation guidelines that do make sense to a certain degree. But let's be real, a lot of these companies also nitpick and say like, well, you didn't provide enough and we're going to claw back money because you just didn't do enough in that. And yeah, there are irresponsible providers, but there is just a lot of burden placed on providers to provide these unduly robust, but also not so robust you're getting yourself into trouble by going to, wild amounts of details and what happens with subpoenas and law and privacy. And oh my gosh, we can get into the many layers of it. But let's be real, offloading some of this would be very, very helpful because it doesn't critically change who we are and what we're doing. However, like this episode, the offloading onto AI is more sophisticated than, say, basic note transcription. And because of that, the risk of losing out on educational opportunities is amplified in some respects because it will be doing the bulk of the work, which means we can literally wipe our hands of it and pay very little attention to it. Now, anybody worth a grain of salt will tell you have to monitor, observe what AI is actually doing, but you and I both also understand that in a very busy world, we would probably, let's port into the future where AI is literally doing everything for us. Will that ever occur? I don't know. Maybe for large corporations and institutions and employ a lot of providers. Maybe. We're probably going to be glancing at it because we want to, go to the restroom, take breaks, and do other things. And there will be there's going to be a lot missed in that, and that is a dangerous thing. And again, segues into the rest of our work. Now, the caveat to this, though, the very interesting thing about what the benefits of AI is, let's say there's this future mode where AI is more locally based, it's not connected to some major entity, and it's doing note transcription for us. What it does is it's trained on, mental health models, not robustly so, I should note right now. And it'll spit out what it thinks you're doing as a provider, or we are doing as providers. And there's potential learning in this because, basic transactional if-then or just transcription service isn't going to interpret anything for you. And so I think it would have been a really interesting experience to be going through school, learning this stuff and having AI spit something back out at me saying like, this is what I hear and see you doing, and seeing how well it matches up or not. So it's kind of a unique opportunity depending on the sophistication of the AI training, not the AI training that we're going through, but the training that AI is going through, to spit out and say like, you're doing this, and does that align? Because I could look at it and go, whoa, where are you getting that? I was intending to do this. And a fork in the road appears as a provider. Like, okay, maybe AI is correctly calling me out that I'm doing less of what I was hoping to do and intending to do, and I need to double down around like what was missing. Can I be more intentional in this sphere? However, AI can absolutely be wrong, and at least current iterations are absolutely capable of being wrong. And even if it advances, I think it's still a matter of interpretation. And so we have to be judicious and go, well, that's interesting. I disagree with it. I actually do think that I'm doing what I'm intending to do. It's just missing it. Still, that self-reflective process, I think, could be really interesting and intriguing from a learning point of view. Now, if it's offloaded into the hands of people with power, that could be used as an oppressive force. Say an insurer scans a session somehow and AI says that's not at all what I would interpret from it. They could go, well, we're not going to reimburse you because you're BS and you're not actually doing what you say that you're doing, or something like that. Kind of big brother sort of stuff. We don't want to get into that. But if we truly use it as an augmentation exercise, in the very least during early training years, it could be kind of a cool and neat and interesting way to go about learning, so long as we're not living in the world of black and white. Spoiler alert, though, a lot of people live in the world of black and white. So see how that goes. Long story short, though, it's another risk for this very episode, that it will steal away the potential benefits of administration. But let's be real, because of the nature of AI, which again is just data processing right now, we're not talking about actual AI, actual learning, there are some potential benefits. There are, if we so choose to wield it as such. All right, now let's get down into the nitty gritty here. The two areas of potential benefit to administration with or without AI. Number one is going to be intakes. These are initial diagnostics. Even if you don't bill through managed care, we should be, when we're first meeting somebody, gathering information, engaging in some sort of case conceptualization. I'll kind of lean a little bit more on the managed care side because there's a lot more documentation requirements and the potential benefits therein. And then the progress notes. This is just the session to session sort of experience of recounting what we did and the topics that came up, et cetera, and go into the benefits of that. So let's start with the intakes. Now, the primary, I mean, hopefully it's obvious enough to most providers, the primary benefit of an initial diagnostic and an intake is the conceptualization piece. It is the ability to hear what someone is reporting to us and port it into some sort of meaningful conceptualization. Now, you might say to yourself, well, I can do that internally up here. I don't need to port that onto a piece of paper. I'm happy to offload it. Well, yes and no. There's something about writing, even if you're just dictating, right? If you're not actually physically writing or typing, there's something about engaging in that sort of consolidation process. It hones what we are doing internally. It requires a translation of that which we are thinking internally into an actual tangible form, never mind doing so in a quasi-succinct fashion. When you talk about taking many layers of information and putting it into a narrative that feels somewhat cohesive, there's a lot of work that goes into that says, like, based on this, and this, when I cluster these together, this is what I am thinking. Here are the potential holes. Here are the intercorrelated components based on the reported social history, the substance use history, and the reported symptomology, or whatever it might be. And when you offload that onto something else, you're not engaging in that critical thought process that really hones what we do live in our brains already. I think of it like journaling. If we are in a world of work where any version of journaling, this sort of self-reflective process, is given to clients as a muscle to work out, why would that not also extend to us and how we encounter the clinical information that is given to us? It is a supremely important skill set. And while it is, it's one of those nice kind of Venn diagram overlaps that it is necessary for billing, it is actually quite clinically beneficial for us as providers. Now, I'll probably note in here somewhere, I guess I should juxtapose this with the cons. When we look at the really intensive intake paperwork that we providers sometimes have to fill out, there's just this like listing out of every freaking sphere of somebody's functioning, and it's just unrealistic. Like, what is truly necessary to initially diagnose someone? It feels very medicalized. I'm going to learn about their social history and their relationship with their parents over time. It does not affect me diagnostically, especially with diagnostic categories that are just very narrow. I don't have 100 options I need to discern between. I mean, they're very basic stuff. Relational sort of issues can come up in screeners, sure, if it's germane to a particular family or category of diagnoses, but we're talking more latent underlying personality issues. You probably shouldn't be diagnosing that right out the gates anyway. So why are we asking so in-depth questions and having to lay it out over and over and over again and then summarize it all in a presenting problem area? It just becomes redundant and silly. We should be asking ourselves, what are the most critical bits of information? Substance use, absolutely, right? But again, family history when it comes to the family environment, no, I'm sorry. That's useless. It just clouds this sort of initial work. Unless you're not doing any history-based work with someone, then maybe so. But this one-size-fits-all, gather every ounce of information is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. It becomes a waste of time. So that really is the key and critical piece when it comes to intakes and initial diagnostic is the presenting problem. The second thing is it's a helpful repetition process if you really boil it down to the critical bits of like learning the repertoire of understanding what is most relevant. When you are early career, it is very easy to forget what might seem like obvious domains to ask and inquire about. But that documentation process, it's almost like riding a bike. When you do it over and over again, if I could magically erase the redundant stupid parts, that sort of repetition is really important for learning. But if we offload this right away, that sort of process is going to die very quickly. And I can imagine a future where providers are just not intuiting that there's something of interest when someone says something a particular way or they bring up a certain topic. They don't go, hey, I've noticed on the front end the relevancy when I ask and get this information early, and thereby maybe I should ask about it now or ask about it ever at all. And so I think if we're seasoned professionals, we take this stuff for granted, and there are going to be major implications if people really don't have to practice this repeatedly. Again, within reason. The problem in the field right now is it just doesn't feel within reason. As I guess a little side tip, one of the ways to shortcut this is sending forms to clientele ahead of time to fill out and populate that. But I'm going to be honest, I forget what is on those intake forms eventually because I need to hear it from the client live and contextualize based on their ongoing, how they describe their problems and their history. Until I have that kind of more narrative, contextualized content, it's really hard for me to retain the information. So even then, it's more of a checkbox than it is really deeply useful outside of initial diagnosis or basic okay, there's a problem generally speaking in this domain we're going to need to dig into to get to the actual depths of it all. So outside of that, I really don't find there to be a lot of other utility to the initial diagnostic process. It's just, again, rapid triage, rapid conceptualization, to which you don't anchor, but is a great and important start point. Never mind a repeated function that you're doing throughout treatment. And what better way to learn that than a kind of intensive administrative process that forces us to kind of narrow, consolidate, and summarize. So there you go. Now, the second piece I think is probably the most important piece, and that's the progress notes. Now, I can imagine old school psychologists go back in the day when we weren't really documenting, there were a ton of self-pay people or whatever it might be. We just had a couple check boxes in our documentation before managed care got unruly with it. They say I can do that internally, or I can do that in what we call process notes. These are notes that created independent of a medical record. It's just for the provider to reflect on what's going on. Why would I need to do this also in a progress note? Well, so maybe it's a function of a really busy and over-busy capitalistic world and capitalistic field nowadays. But, I don't know what that's like. And so maybe I'm overinflating the value of progress notes. But for what it's worth, when I encounter progress notes initially, it's right, what did they report? Why, there's just these stupid redundant sections of what do they generally report? What's the objective information? What's the mental status? Holy crap, y'all. Super severe cases, sure, document all this stuff, but every single case, please, for the love, leave me alone. However, Generally speaking, the essence of progress notes are this. One, how do we, again, succinctly self-reflect and go, what was it that we were talking about? But most importantly, what it challenges is like, how do I translate this into what I would call mechanisms of change? What is it that I'm doing underneath the content? And what I think this really helps is it protects against people drifting into atheoretical approaches. It's this this repeated process of going, what was I doing? What was the mechanism? And if you're really being diligent with the notes, you should be frequently translating, like, I keep doing this thing, but what function does it serve? Is it a here and now function, or is there a greater arc in the overall progress of therapy that is important? And so this translation of skills, like this was a clarification process. And what does clarification in psychodynamic therapy do? When I'm relationally processing, is that kind of part and parcel to what I'm doing and I probably include in almost every single note? Or is there something unique because, say, today was a more existential bend or a more narrative building sort of bend? When I'm engaging in this sort of process of like thinking about what's going on internally, this metacognitive process, why am I doing that? I'm doing it right now, but what's the greater purpose or function of it? And so it translates these really academic understandings of what approaches are supposed to constitute and forces a provider to meld that with what is actually experientially happening. And when there are divergences or there are like massive holes, then it's a prompt to go like, that's interesting. I didn't do as much as I maybe thought I did. What is that about? Why did I not do more in that session? Or why did I sit more passively in that session? Or that's interesting. I actually don't know where I'm at in a potential arc in therapy, right? So here's my understanding of how change often happens for folks with these sorts of problems or these sorts of issues. Have I lost track somehow? Or do I not even know where I'm going? I think a lot of providers are scared to admit it, but it's like, I don't know what the arc is. I'm just kind of showing up. And then sometimes I lose track, but then we'll hit an area and it feels really productive. And so we do that. But that feels a little too aimless or hapless for me, which one, we're a little bit too hard on ourselves, I think. But again, in its essence, is a really important prompt to be like, how do I understand why we're not doing the exposure part of therapy right now? Is it because we're working on basic fundamental grounding that precedes it? Is that what this is about? It's such an important process. Again, technically speaking, we could just do that in our free time between sessions. If heaven forbid, I don't know, we just had 30 minutes between all of our sessions. We were allowed to think about what the heck just happened to us rather than moving right on to the next client that we see. So I'm, again, not against the idea that the systems we have created around mental health care are broke AF, but still, if there's a silver lining to these progress notes, I think it's a really important thing that if you can just carve out a little bit of extra time, if you have that time, to think critically is like, what is it that I'm doing? Why am I doing what I'm doing? And how does it fit into a greater arc or narrative? Not that I'm wed to this one narrow path, but based on what we've been doing and what I know so far, how am I keeping track of this? Us relational folks say the clients are also responsible for keeping track of this to a certain degree, or at least conceptualizing and noticing how things are changing. But it is, I think, really an important domain of us providers to understand the arc. This is where manualized treatments, as much as I dislike them for, I would argue, 75% of clients, they do it well because at least there's a path. In these other models, when there's no path, there is danger in not having a single path. So you need to at least have an overarching sort of typical process in mind that you've internalized and is holding you honest. Should you and your patient lose your way along the way? So hopefully that makes sense. But again, it's like, what's the plan and it's like, yeah, okay, sure. If you're doing what I just said, you're basically good. The rest of the notes, like, whatever, right? It's CYA, it's basic information, it's bullshit that the managed care companies want. It's an amalgam of all of the above, but it doesn't mean that it's useless. I find most of my growth is reflecting not from about the progress note itself, but like where am I in the arc of things? Why am I shifting back to this, and what are the mechanisms that seem most fruitful for this individual? So, all right, probably repeated myself too many times. 20 minutes? I thought it was gonna be like a 10, 15 minute. Nobody ever listens past like 5 or 10 minutes or 50% of the episodes. Well, I mean, hopefully this is helpful. If you'd like to challenge yourself as a provider for the potential benefit of the administrative components of our profession, well, there you go. That's my 2 cents for whatever that's worth. Again, if you're a layperson who's not a member, not an actual provider, then hopefully just interesting to think about what's going on behind the scenes for us providers. But yeah, I think that's it. So as always, thank you for listening and watching, and stay curious.